Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be reviewing the solo mode for Dune Imperium from designer Paul Dennen and publisher Direwolf Games. Dune Imperium is based off of the upcoming film of the same name and the popular Dune intellectual property. I'm going to show you mostly the differences between the multiplayer game and the solo game. So let's head over to the table, I'll show you that, then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we see a starting setup for Dune Imperium, the solo game. First thing I want to say is I'm not going to go into a heavy rules overview because we also just did this week a full multiplayer four-way review on the channel, and if you want to get a good idea on how the game plays kind of all the way through, take a look at that. Tom does a great job on doing an overview for the game. What I'm going to be focusing on is what's different between the solo game and the multiplayer game. And so starting with setup, the first thing you can do is look at the solo sheet here. This is for the solo and two-player games. It's a separate sheet. And you can look at the difficulty. And so what I did was, just for the sake of explanation, I went on the novice, the mercenary level. And so what that means is a couple of things. Number one, I started with an extra Solari and a spice, which you can see reflected here. I'd be playing as Helena. I have my starting water, which we all got, and I got a spice and a Solari as well. The other thing is that I did not put a 5 Solari token on the Mentat space, which is right here. Normally it's 2 to get this space, and if you want to make it more difficult, you can make it cost 5 to go there. I didn't do that. There are no rival starting garrison troops. I have my 3 as per normal. If I had gone into the next one, we'd put 3 of each of the other 2 rivals in there as well, but we did not. And then the number of conflict cards above the rival sword masters. And in this case, it'd be 5. This is the first one. And then right below that, you'd see this is where their sword masters are. And that's how they would gain their 3rd workers. So you can change up the difficulty, change up the setup based on that difficulty, just using this chart right here. Okay, so I went with the novice, easiest level, I should say. All right. The other things that are different about the game is that you've got this deck of House Hagal cards. Okay, this is really how you do the solo actions. You would remove the cards that say 2P up in the upper right hand corner. For a 1-player game, these would be kept in if you were playing as a 2-player game. The 2-player game also uses these rival agents. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to show you the app, okay? This app is in pre-release, and so it may change a little bit, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to show you the app. You've got the solo game here. Choose your leader, okay? That's my leader. And then my 2 rivals are... Oops, nope, sorry. There we go. Okay, and so it shows you right here, if depending on which difficulty you place it on, and I went with this mercenary, I've got those starting resources, they each have those, okay? And it tells you also where to put those sword masters. The first player marker goes to the rival there, and it shows you here ready to draw cards. So the first player is Count Ilbon there, so let's draw a card to find out where they go. So they're going to go to the fold space spot and do what it says on this card, which in this case is going to be, I would take one of these rival agents, put it on this fold space card, and that means that he's going to go up 1 in influence with the Spacing Guild. Okay, so that spot has been taken from me, and they're gaining influence with these different guilds. All right, then I would take my turn as per normal. I have my 5 starting cards. I would look at the cards to see where I wanted to go. Perhaps I would play my Seek Allies card. I would go here. I would move up in influence there. I'd gain another water. Okay, so that was my turn. And then we would go to the Beast's turn. And there would love to go to full space, but it's already taken. So in that case, you go again, and they're going to harvest spice. Now in this case, these 3 spice spots in between rounds during the makers portion would potentially gain more spice, but they don't start with any there at the beginning of the round. What they're going to normally do is go to the space that has the most spice built up. In this case, there are none, so they would want to go to the space that would get the most spice. That would be the Great Flat. However, it costs 2 water to go there. They don't have 2 water, so instead they're going to go here to the Haga Basin. They'll pay their water. They'll gain their 2 spice. Now, why would they be gaining resources? That's because in the solo game, they will immediately spend resources for victory points. And just like in the multiplayer game, you're trying to get to 10 victory points. So you can see the conversion here. 3 influence cards, 3 water, 7 Solari, 7 spice. Anytime either of your rivals get that amount, they instantly turn them in to gain a victory point. And so they're going to be gaining victory points in the exact same way that you do on the board. In other words, they'll gain victory points by getting to particular areas on the influence track. They'll gain points in combat, which I'll talk about in a moment. So they'll be gaining points in the traditional ways, but they also will get points by turning in the resources that they gain at these different spots, be they intrigue cards or water or Solari or spice. Now, speaking of conflict, if they go to conflict spaces, like this for example, Carthag, this means that they would take a troop from their supply and put it into their garrison. But this is a conflict space, so let's say that Count Ilban had actually drawn this card. They would draw one of their cubes and place it directly into the combat. At the end of the round, well, I shouldn't say at the end of the round, at the combat phase of the round, after we've taken our turns, and they also do not take reveal turns, by the way. That's something that you still do as a player, but they don't take reveal turns. Any of the players who are in the combat, so let's say that this was the situation here, any of the players in combat will draw a card to gain a combat bonus. So if this was a scenario where I had 2 troops in combat, that would give me a strength of 4 in this combat, and it would gain Ilban a strength of 2. However, if I don't play any intrigue cards, if I don't have any, for example, or I choose not to play them, oops, my strength would be at 4, but I would have to draw a card for Ilban that would gain 2 there. So they would now be at the same strength, and now we're going to have to split the rewards. They get the rewards the same way that a regular player would, okay? So combat is something that is kept in with the solo game, and depending on the particular round, they can be pretty aggressive on gaining troops, garrisoning troops, and placing them into the combat. You have to fight with them just like you would with a traditional opponent, okay? And so that's how the game is going to play out. You're going to take your turns as per normal. You're going to draw cards for the rival opponents in the correct turn order. They're going to be placing their workers out after a certain number of rounds. They're going to gain their extra Swordmaster here. That will give them 3 turns around as per normal. And you just go through the game with the same end game triggers as in the traditional game, and whoever has the most points is going to win. That gives you a brief overview of how the solo game plays out differently than the traditional game. Why don't we head back over and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea on the differences between the solo game and the multiplayer game. There are a few things that I didn't go over. For example, there are times where you have to make choices on behalf of your rival opponents, but they cover that very clearly in the rule book. It's not difficult to tell what to do in the case of a choice. So small things like that I didn't cover in the overview. As I said, I wasn't going into a heavy rules teach. This was just to give you a basic sense for how the game played as a solo game versus a multiplayer game. And if you wanted to get even more detail on that, as I mentioned, go check out Tom's overview in our big 4-way multiplayer review. So the first thing I like to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are things that I discuss when I'm assessing a solo game and the strengths and weaknesses of it. The first thing I like to talk about is win-loss condition. Is it a beat your high score variant? Is it a clear win-loss condition? And in the case of Dune Imperium, you're playing against 2 rival opponents, and there is very clearly a win-loss condition. You could end up in 3rd place in a solo game of Dune Imperium. You could be behind both of the AI rivals, and depending on the difficulty level you choose, that's a very viable possibility. The easy game, the novice game, is one that I feel like has a nice level of difficulty, but it is certainly one that I felt like I could beat on a regular, somewhat regular basis, especially as I got more proficient with the game. So the easy level or the novice level is just that. It's for novices. It is one that presents enough of a challenge, but not so much of a challenge that you don't feel like it's possible to beat. So clear win-loss condition on this particular solo variant. The other thing I like to talk about is setup and teardown time. That is something that can oftentimes be a determining factor on whether you get a solo game off of the shelf or not. And in the case of Dune Imperium, this is a very manageable setup. There is a bit of time involved. It's a worker placement game, a deck building game, so there's a fair amount of cards, there's a fair amount of bits, but with just a little bit of organization with baggies, and especially if you have bit trays like you may have seen in the video, it makes the setup time very reasonable. I'd say within 3 minutes, perhaps, to set up the solo game. And so that I think is very, very reasonable for the amount of gameplay that you get out of it. The other thing I like to talk about in these benchmarks are the rules. And in the case of Dune Imperium, the rules are wonderfully done. They are on a separate single sheet, okay? They're not within the main rule book. They're on a single sheet that is separated from that book. And it's for both the two-player and the solo game rules because they both use that AI deck of cards or the app if you choose to go in that direction. Again, I want to make it clear that the app is not necessary to play this game two-player or solo. The deck of cards and the rules are in the box. That's everything that you need. I just wanted to show you the app in case you wanted to go that direction. But the rules were very clear. They're on their own. There's no confusion there. I felt like they did a very good job of giving illustrated examples when that was appropriate. And there were no edge cases that I found in my plays of the game. And so I feel like the rules were very well done, both in the multiplayer game and also in the solo game. The other thing I like to talk about are art and components. And this is something that I mentioned in the multiplayer game, but this is a little bit of a mixed bag. I feel like the cards are very well done. I feel like the iconography throughout the game is very well done. I felt like it was consistent and clear. And once I got an idea for what the symbols meant, it was not something where I was having to refer to the rule book often, if at all, after the first game. I felt like it was very, very well done on that front. The issue that I have is that the board specifically is not the most attractive. It's not the most enticing to look at. Now, I understand that there's a bit of a trade-off there. Sometimes beautiful boards can be convoluted, and I will say that the board is very clear. It's very easy to delineate which spaces are which and what the costs and benefits for each space are, and that's very important in a worker placement game like this. So that's a positive, but there's a huge portion of the board that's the combat area that is really just bland. There's nothing, you know, because the combat in this game is so exciting, it is so nerve-wracking that it would be nice if that was reflected with something on the board that popped, that really reflected the importance of it and the sense of anxiety and competition that you feel, even against AI opponents. And so that's a bit of a letdown. Also, I feel like the card quality is probably not the best. After a number of games, I'm starting to feel like the cards might do well to be sleeved. So the art and components are a bit of a mixed bag. Overall, I do think the game is very functional. I like the art on the cards. The wooden components are nice, but the board itself is a little bit lackluster. I will mention, as was mentioned in the multiplayer review, that there is going to be in the future an upgrade pack you can purchase for this. That's going to add miniatures and influence markers that are upgraded, and I'm sure that will improve the look of the game significantly, but it's also going to improve make the price quite a bit higher. The upgrade pack retail is actually $5 more than the retail for the base game. So that's something that you'd have to keep in mind for that as well. All right, so my overall solo impressions for Dune Imperium. Well, I'm going to put this out there. I gave the multiplayer game a rating of 9 out of 10. Seal of excellence. Fantastic game. I feel like the solo game is right there. Very, very close to that rating. To give a bit of a spoiler, it's still going to be getting a seal of excellence. I'm going to get it just under a 9. And the reason why is that as a solo game, it really retains much of that anxiety, that pressure, that delicious tension that you feel in the multiplayer game, because these AI rivals are competing with you in almost every way that a traditional player would. Okay, they're going to be moving up those influence tracks. They're going to be blocking spots from you. They're going to be placing their influence markers in such a way that they get bonuses depending on particular spots. And so that part is done very well. They also compete in the combat, and depending again on what level of difficulty you play on, they can be pretty aggressive in those combats. And so all of that is done very well. The only reason I'm going to take it slightly lower than my multiplayer review is that there is a level that just can't be replicated in a solo game of kind of the feel around the table. And in a game like this, where there's a little bit of paranoia, and what intrigue cards do you have? What are you trying to do there? That just can't quite be replicated in a solo game. And there's nothing they can do about it. It's no fault of the game. But that's why I rate it slightly lower as a solo game than I do as a multiplayer game, just because although they get those combat bonuses, they don't have the ability to do that kind of big play on on a combat turn with those intrigue cards. And in a multiplayer game, there's a very real sense of excitement, a little bit of paranoia when you know that your opponent is holding 2 or 3 intrigue cards, and you feel like you've got a pretty solid chance of winning that combat, but you don't know what those cards can do, and they can be game changers. And that just can't be replicated in the solo game. So that's the main reason why it's slightly lower. But that being said, this is a fantastic solo game. It's one that still is one of the better solo worker placement games that I've played. It's one of the better solo deck building games that I've played. And the fact that you can still have that deck building experience without the AI even really involved in that aspect at all is pretty impressive. The one thing is that you do have to keep in mind, you're really the only one going to that card market. And so that is also something that changes a bit between the solo game and the multiplayer game. And in the multiplayer game, you know, those cards, there might be cards you're trying to get. That's not necessarily going to happen here. And so that is something you have to keep in mind. But overall, as a solo game, I'm still giving this an 8.5 out of 10 and a seal of excellence. This is one of the better games that I've played this year, multiplayer. I was curious, would they be able to pull it off as a solo game? And they absolutely did. They did a tremendous job of replicating the experience the best you can under the constraints of a solo game. They did a really good job of replicating that experience that the multiplayer game provides. Thank you so much for your time as always, and have a great day.